A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Imagine it is 1824. You have a splitting headache, a bit of a fever, and you feel generally run down. You walk into the most prestigious medical office in London or Philadelphia. The doctor, a man of immense learning and high social standing, looks at you and reaches for a small velvet-lined box. Inside are several Hirudo medicinal leeches, or perhaps he pulls out a brass lancet. He isn't a fringe nut, he is practicing the absolute gold standard of care that has existed for 2,000 years. He's going to drain a pint of your blood to save your life.
It is staggering to think about the sheer longevity of that practice. We aren't talking about a fad that lasted a decade. Bloodletting and the humoral theory it supported dominated human medicine from the time of Hippocrates in 400 BCE all the way into the early 1900s. Today's prompt from Daniel is about exactly this. The historical process of medical surrender. He wants to know how long it took for science to actually admit these things were bogus, and what that transition looks like when a foundational belief is exposed as having zero medicinal value.
It's a bit terrifying, isn't it? The idea that you could have 25 centuries of consensus, not just an opinion, but a global institutional consensus that is fundamentally, fatally wrong. By the way, today's episode is powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash. It's writing our script today, which is fitting because we're talking about how data eventually overrides dogma. Herman Poppleberry, you've been digging into the archives on this. When we talk about the surrendering process, where does the crack in the armor actually start?
The crack starts when you move from anecdote to arithmetic. For 2 millennia, medicine was a narrative art. If a doctor bled a patient and they got better, the bloodletting worked. If they bled the patient and the patient died, well, they were clearly too far gone, or perhaps they weren't bled enough. It was a perfectly closed logical loop. The surrender began in the 1830s, specifically with a French physician named Pierre Louis. He's the father of the numerical method, which we now call clinical statistics.
So, before Pierre Louis, no one was actually counting? They were just winging it based on vibes and ancient Greek texts?
Essentially, yes. In 1835, Louis published a study of 78 pneumonia patients. This was revolutionary. Instead of describing one miraculous recovery, he tracked 78 cases and compared those bled early in the disease versus those bled later. What he found was a statistical nightmare for the medical establishment. There was no evidence that bleeding shortened the disease or lowered mortality. In fact, the data suggested that the patients who weren't bled or were bled very little actually fared better.
I can only imagine the medical board meetings after that. Did they just say, oh, our bad, let's put the leeches away? Or was it more of a scorched earth defense of the status quo?
It was a decades-long battle. You have to understand the institutional inertia here. Bloodletting wasn't just a treatment, it was tied to the humoral theory, the idea that health was a balance of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you admit bloodletting is useless, you aren't just changing a prescription, you are admitting your entire map of the human body is a work of fiction. The resistance was fierce because the stakes were professional survival.
It's that old saying that science advances one funeral at a time, but there's a specific period Daniel mentioned, the 1830s and 80s. You mentioned Pierre Louis in 1835, but wasn't there a massive event in 1840 that forced the hand of the medical community?
The 1840 London cholera epidemic is a fascinating case study in crisis-driven surrender. Cholera was the great terror of the 19th century. It was fast, it was gruesome, and the standard treatment was, of course, aggressive bloodletting. But in 1840, the sheer scale of the failure became impossible to ignore. Doctors were bleeding patients who were already profoundly dehydrated and in hypovolemic shock. They were literally draining the last bit of life out of people who were dying of fluid loss.
Talk about a counterproductive treatment. It's like trying to put out a fire by pouring gasoline on it, because your ancient textbook says gasoline is a cooling agent.
That's exactly what it was. During that 1840 outbreak, several prominent physicians in London noticed that the mortality rate among the bled was nearly 100%. It was so obviously fatal that they stopped mid-crisis. This is one of the rare moments where the surrendering process was sudden rather than gradual. The reality on the ground was so violent that the dogma snapped.
But even then, leeches didn't vanish overnight. I've read that France was still importing tens of millions of leeches a year well into the middle of the 19th century. Why does it take so long for the tail end of the practice to die out?
Because of the authority structure. Even if the elite research hospitals in Paris or London started to pivot, the country doctor in rural Devon or a practitioner in a small town in Pennsylvania didn't have access to real-time data. They had their training from 30 years prior and the expectations of their patients. Patients actually demanded to be bled. If you were a doctor and you didn't bleed a feverish patient, and that patient died, you could be sued for malpractice or accused of negligence. The surrender isn't just a scientific shift, it's a cultural one.
That's a crucial point. If the public believes the humors are real, a doctor who refuses to balance them looks like a quack. It's a total inversion of reality. The guy trying to save you by keeping your blood inside your body is the one seen as dangerous.
It took the rise of germ theory and cellular pathology, the work of people like Louis Pasteur and Rudolf Virchow to finally provide a new map. You can't just tell people their map is wrong, you have to give them a better one. Once we understood that pneumonia was caused by bacteria and not an excess of the sanguine humor, bloodletting finally lost its mechanistic justification. By the 1890s, it was largely relegated to very specific, rare conditions like polycythemia, where it actually is medically indicated.
So that's the physical side. But Daniel also asked about the mental side, the humors in psychiatry. That seems like it would be even harder to surrender because you couldn't just point to a bacteria under a microscope to prove someone wasn't suffering from too much black bile.
Psychiatry is where the surrendering process gets really messy and, frankly, quite dark. The humoral theory of mental illness suggested that melancholy, for instance, was literally caused by an excess of black bile. The treatments involved massive doses of laxatives, emetics to make you vomit, and, again, bloodletting to drain the bad humors.
It sounds like they were just trying to exhaust the patient into submission. If you're busy vomiting and fainting from blood loss, you probably don't have the energy to be manic or depressed.
You've hit on a very cynical but accurate point. The surrender of humoral psychiatry didn't really happen until we started developing the first primitive understandings of neurology in the late 19th century. But even then, the surrender was incomplete. We traded humors for other bogus theories. We went from bad bile to the rest cure, where women like Charlotte Perkins Gilman were literally locked in rooms and forbidden from reading or writing to cure their neurasthenia.
I remember reading about the rest cure. That was Silas Weir Mitchell's big thing in the 1880s, right? It was basically medically mandated boredom and overfeeding. It's another example of a practice that had a huge institutional backing despite being psychologically torturous.
And the surrender there was sparked by the patients themselves. Charlotte Perkins Gilman wrote The Yellow Wallpaper as a direct indictment of that treatment. It took a combination of patient advocacy and the eventual realization that neurological disorders weren't just about frayed nerves that needed rest. But the timeline is the key. Weir Mitchell was a titan of medicine. As long as he was alive and influential, the rest cure stayed. The institutional surrender often waits for the primary advocate of the bogus treatment to leave the stage.
This brings up a really interesting mechanism of the surrendering process. It's not just about the evidence, it's about the hierarchy. If the guy who wrote the textbook is still the head of the medical society, no junior doctor is going to publicly call his life's work a sham.
There is a sociological term for this called the Planck principle, named after physicist Max Planck. He famously said that a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die, and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. In the history of medicine, this is the dominant mode of surrender. It's a generational turnover.
Let's look at some of the more colorful examples of this. I'm thinking about the transition away from heroic medicine in the United States. This was that period in the early 19th century where doctors like Benjamin Rush were advocating for truly massive amounts of bloodletting and mercury treatments.
Benjamin Rush is the perfect villain hero of this story. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a brilliant man, but his medical theories were lethal. During the 1793 yellow fever outbreak in Philadelphia, he was bleeding people until they fainted and then doing it again the next day. He believed the body could hold much more blood than it actually does. He was working off a theoretical model that was completely detached from the reality of human physiology.
And he was so respected that no one could stop him. I mean, he was the Surgeon General of the Continental Army.
He was untouchable. The surrender of heroic medicine in America only happened because of a rival movement called Thomsonianism, which was basically a populist herbal medicine movement. People were so terrified of the regular doctors and their lancets and mercury that they turned to steam baths and cayenne pepper. It was a market-driven surrender. The regular doctors were losing so many patients to the herbalists that they were forced to moderate their treatments just to stay in business.
That's a fascinating angle. That the surrender was forced by the patients essentially going on strike against being tortured. It wasn't necessarily that the doctors suddenly became more scientific. They just realized their customers were fleeing for their lives.
It's a bit of both. But even the move away from mercury calomel was the big one. Took forever. Calomel was a mercury-based purgative that caused your teeth to fall out and your gums to rot. Doctors thought this was a good sign. They called it salivation and believed it meant the toxins were leaving the body. The surrender of calomel didn't fully happen until the American Civil War.
Wait, really? The 1860s?
Yes. The Surgeon General of the Union Army, William Hammond, issued an order in 1863 removing calomel from the Army supply table because he saw it was doing more harm than the wounds. The medical establishment was so outraged that they actually had him court-martialed and kicked out of the Army.
You are kidding me. They court-martialed the guy for stopping them from poisoning soldiers with mercury?
They did. They felt his order was an insult to their professional judgment. It took 15 years for Hammond to be exonerated. That is what medical surrender looks like in the real world. It's not a polite shrug, it's an institutional civil war. The people who have spent their lives mastering a bogus technique will fight to the death to protect its legitimacy.
It makes me wonder about the psychological state of those doctors. If you've spent 40 years bleeding people and you suddenly realize you've likely killed hundreds of them who might have lived, that's a heavy burden. Maybe the resistance to surrender is a form of self-protection. If I admit this is wrong now, I have to admit I've been a monster for my entire career.
I think that's a huge factor. There's a profound psychological sunk cost fallacy at play. If you look at the middle of the 19th century, you see this tension everywhere. Take the case of Ignaz Semmelweis and hand washing. We think of it as a simple hygiene thing now, but at the time, he was suggesting that doctors were the ones carrying the cadaverous particles that were killing women in the maternity wards.
And the doctors hated that because it implied they were the cause of death, not the cure.
Semmelweis was essentially asking them to surrender their image as pure, life-saving healers. He was told that a gentleman's hands are always clean. He ended up in a mental asylum, likely beaten to death by guards, while the medical community continued to ignore his data for another 2 decades until Joseph Lister finally made the case for antisepsis.
It's a recurring theme. The person with the data gets crushed by the person with the prestige, but eventually the data wins. What about the role of technology in this? Daniel mentioned leeches, and we've talked about the lancet. Does the invention of new tools accelerate the surrender?
It does, but often in ways that are unexpected. The invention of the stethoscope by René Laennec in 1816 was a massive turning point. Before the stethoscope, the doctor's primary tool was his ears and his philosophy. The stethoscope allowed for an objective physical finding, the sound of the heart and lungs. It shifted the focus from the patient's overall humors to a specific organ. Once you start thinking about the heart as a pump and the lungs as bellows, the idea of draining blood to balance an abstract humor starts to look ridiculous.
So the tool itself changes the mental model. It forces you to look at the body as a machine rather than a bowl of soup.
Precisely. And in the late 19th century, the development of the sphygmomanometer, the blood pressure cuff, did the same thing. Suddenly, you could measure pressure. You didn't have to guess if someone had a hard pulse. You had a number. And when you had a number, you could see that bloodletting didn't actually fix the underlying issues of hypertension in the way they thought it did.
We've been talking about these big dramatic shifts, but I'm curious about the more subtle ones. Daniel asked about the colorful periods of history. What about the transition away from the rest cure or the early days of psychiatry? Was there a moment where people just collectively decided, okay, we're done with the ice pick lobotomies?
The lobotomy is a perfect 20th century example of this process. It was pioneered by Egas Moniz, who won a Nobel Prize for it in 1949. Think about that. The Nobel Prize for essentially scrambling someone's frontal lobe with a needle. It was the standard of care for severe mental illness for over a decade.
And the surrender there was remarkably fast compared to bloodletting, right?
It was, and the reason was chemical. In 1952, chlorpromazine, thorazine, was discovered. It was the first true antipsychotic. Almost overnight, you had a pill that could achieve better results than a surgical procedure that left people permanently brain damaged. The surrender of the lobotomy didn't happen because people suddenly developed a moral objection to it. It happened because a cheaper, more effective, and less messy alternative appeared.
So, technological displacement is the most effective form of surrender. You don't have to win the argument if you just provide a better tool.
That's the pattern. The humoral theory of mental illness didn't fully die until we had the first generation of antidepressants and antipsychotics in the 50s and 60s. Once you could manipulate brain chemistry with precision, the idea of black bile felt like a fairy tale, but even then you see the remnants. We still talk about chemical imbalances, which is, in many ways, just a more sophisticated version of humoral theory. We like the idea that a single substance is responsible for our mood.
That's a stinging observation. We haven't really moved past the desire for a simple, liquid explanation for human suffering. We just changed the names of the liquids from bile to serotonin.
It's a cautionary tale about the humility of the present. Every generation thinks they've finally reached the end of the surrendering process. We look back at the doctors of 1840 and think, how could they be so blind? But they were using the best evidence and theories available to them. They were the smartest people in the room.
This leads me to the practical side of this. If we know that it takes 20 to 40 years for a bogus treatment to be fully surrendered, what does that mean for us today? How do we identify the leeches of the 21st century?
The first takeaway is to look at institutional inertia. If a treatment is being defended primarily by appeal to authority or tradition rather than transparent, reproducible data, that's a red flag. The second takeaway is the mechanism. Bloodletting persisted because it had a really compelling story, the humors. If a medical practice today has a great story but a fuzzy mechanism, it might be on the list for future surrender.
I think about routine surgeries that suddenly go out of fashion. You mentioned tonsillectomies in the 80s. That was a huge one. It was almost a rite of passage for kids to get their tonsils out. Then, suddenly, the data showed that for the vast majority of cases, the risks of surgery outweighed the benefits of preventing a few sore throats.
And that surrender was hard. There were surgeons who had built their entire practices around that procedure. It took a massive shift in pediatric guidelines and a lot of pushback from insurance companies to actually change the behavior. This is a key point. Sometimes the surrender is driven by the payers, not the practitioners.
That's the modern version of the herbalist taking the regular doctor's business. If the insurance company won't pay for the leeches go away.
Another modern example is the routine use of episiotomies during childbirth. For decades, it was taught as a way to prevent tearing and protect the baby. It was the gold standard. But the data eventually showed it actually caused more harm and slower healing. Yet, it took 20 years for the rates to drop significantly because it was so deeply ingrained in the training of obstetricians.
It's that training lag again. You repeat what you were taught in your residency, and it takes a whole new generation of residents to be taught the new way before the old way truly dies.
Which means that as patients and as informed citizens, we have to recognize that the medical consensus is always provisional. It's the best guess we have right now. The surrendering process is a sign of health and science, not a sign of failure. The fact that we stopped bloodletting is a triumph of the scientific method over human ego.
But it's a slow triumph. It's like a massive tanker ship trying to turn around in a narrow canal. It's going to scrape the sides. It's going to take a long time, and a lot of people are going to get hurt in the process.
That's the tragedy of medical history. The gap between the discovery of the truth and the institutional surrender of the lie is measured in human lives. Whether it's the 1840 cholera epidemic or the delay in adopting hand washing, that lag time is where the suffering happens.
So, what can listeners actually do with this? If you're navigating the medical system today, how do you protect yourself from a practice that is currently in that 20-year lag period before surrender?
I think the most actionable thing is to ask about the strength of the evidence base. Is this a practice that has been validated by large-scale, randomized controlled trials, or is it based on expert consensus? Expert consensus is often just a fancy way of saying we've always done it this way.
I'd also add, look for the second-order effects. If a doctor suggests a treatment, ask what happens if you don't do it. The doctors in 1824 would have told you that if you didn't get bled, your fever would consume you. But the data from Pierre-Louis showed that the body often heals itself better without the interference. Sometimes the most radical thing a doctor can do is nothing.
That was the big realization of the 19th century, the healing power of nature, or vis medicatrix naturae. The surrender of bloodletting allowed doctors to rediscover that the human body has incredible self-regulating mechanisms. We spent 2,000 years trying to force the body into balance when we should have been supporting its natural ability to find it.
It's a humbling thought. We think we're so advanced with our robotic surgeries and targeted gene therapies, but I wonder what the version of this podcast in the year 2100 will be saying about us. They'll probably be laughing about how we used to poison people with chemotherapy to cure cancer.
They almost certainly will. Chemotherapy is a very blunt instrument. It's essentially systemic poisoning in the hope that the cancer dies before the patient does. It's a heroic medicine for the 21st century. We will almost certainly look back on it with the same wincing empathy we feel for the people who were bled for their headaches.
It's a good reminder to stay curious and a little bit skeptical. Not cynical, but skeptical. The surrender is coming for all of us eventually.
And that's a good thing. The day we stop surrendering our bad ideas is the day science actually dies. We should be looking for the bogus treatments in our own lives and our own fields. Where are we using the equivalent of leeches? Because it's what we were taught 20 years ago.
I'm pretty sure my diet is about 90% leeches at this point, but that's a topic for another day. This has been a fascinating deep dive, Herman. The history of bloodletting is basically the history of human stubbornness.
It really is. And it's a tribute to the people like Pierre-Louis and Ignaz Semmelweis who were willing to be the outcast to bring the data that eventually forced the surrender. They are the real heroes of this story.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap this one up before I start feeling phantom leeches on my neck. Big thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flemingtop, for keeping the wheels on this thing.
And a huge thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the generation of this show. We couldn't do this deep dive exploration without that kind of support.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you enjoyed our trek through the bloody history of medical surrender, do us a favor and leave a review on your favorite podcast app. It really does help other people find the show and helps us keep these deep dives going.
We'll be back next time with whatever weirdness Daniel throws our way. Keep your humors balanced, but maybe stay away from the lancets.
See ya.
Bye.
This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash, text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth